giggles last time, so I'm not having the giggles, so just get it out now. Yeah, okay. All right, so gentlemen, thank you so much for joining for today's podcast. And we know that this is such an important topic. We see that nationally, men are underrepresented in access to psychological services. And actually, Rob, we're seeing the same in terms of access to our own HIV psychological services. So do you want to start by telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as you say, kind of the NHS talking therapy services, you see about 36% of referrals are for men, and then for our service here for you, we see referral rates at around 12 to 15% for men. When we see the NHS workforce is made up of about 25%, 20 to 25% men, you can see it's still massively underrepresented.
And what do you think are some of the barriers to access for men?
Yeah, I think it's quite a kind of a complicated topic and thing to think about, and we have to think about people as individuals. And at the same time, I think there are some wider kind of cultural ideas and some structural things that pose barriers. I think one is around stigma, and here it's this intersection of stigma around mental health, those kind of quite shaming and negative views around struggling with our mental health that exist, coupled with some kind of strong stories around what it can be to be a man and masculinity as well, particularly say within our culture. And if you think about the kind of shaming, silencing ideas about mental health, you suffer in silence, you're kind of by yourself. And then alongside some views around kind of men maybe needing to be kind of, you know, very resilient, very independent, maybe less likely to kind of come forward and seek help. And doing those things being seen as weakness, there's that kind of double-fold thing that can be quite silencing. But I also think we need to hold that in mind while also acknowledging there's lots of different views of men and masculinity that we're kind of influenced by, and everyone is. And that some of the barriers to access might also be kind of structural, how we're kind of organising services. How do we think about what mental health support entails? It's not just about medication, it's not just about talking therapies. Maybe other things that are very important to people. So I think it's kind of trying to think of it in two ways.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I guess, you know, part of today is trying to address that and trying to improve that kind of equity of access. So what are some of the things that you think we can do in order to encourage men to firstly talk about their health, both mental and physical, and also to access support services? I'll go to you, Sid, first, James.
Yes, I think there's lots of things really. A lot of this is about, as an individual, being aware of other people that we work with, and that we whether we're a manager or a colleague. You know, simple things like if you share an office with someone and actually you're noticing someone appears stressed, you know, an opportunity to appropriately ask that individual about, you know, anything I can do to help. You know, that sounded like a difficult call. Do you want to talk about it? And equally, as a line manager, you might be experiencing a member of staff who's copying you into emails which are appearing increasingly heated, and that can be a sign that not only work is becoming stressful, but there may be underlying things which are compounding how that person is being able to, you know, experience in work in the moment. So I think, you know, we have a duty and a responsibility as staff and colleagues of you know, caring about each other and individuals. And I think being aware of what's going on around us is really important. So actually, you know, taking the time to speak to people, to understand what's impacting them. And I think, and often that may not be easy to do in the work environment. It might be that, you know, we're on an away day or having food afterwards or something like that. It gives us an opportunity to maybe delve a little bit deeper into something that maybe someone feels more comfortable to talk about.
Thank you. It sounds like there's also a bit of intention that's required in building up relationships in order to create that safety as well.
Definitely.
That's really helpful. Thank you. What about you?
I think it's getting involved with like some of the actual incentives that we have within our own organisation and getting more, like, you know, mirroring what you're saying about awareness, is that getting people sort of trained in being perhaps more aware, because I think that we're all guilty sometimes of not being aware of our own sort of feelings as well as other people's feelings. And so if you get involved with some of the incentives that we have, mental health first aiders, there's the wellbeing allies, there's the frontline body network, all of those kinds of things, so that you can start understanding how you can engage in those conversations, because sometimes it could just be something as simple as just asking somebody how they are and actually checking in how they are. We're very as the British sort of go and the way that we sort of talk to each other, it's always, you know, you all right as a greeting rather than it being an actual question of checking in with somebody. And I think it's just starting those conversations, raising that awareness and getting involved with incentives, getting more, I guess, from a men's perspective as well, more male representation in it, because I know that I'm one of the few within the Frontline Buddy network of men that actually get involved in these incentives, and that hopefully by getting involved in things like this and having these conversations, that it will show to other men that it's okay to get involved with these things and that there shouldn't be any stigma around it.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Lee?
I think a massive part is also role modelling. When you read in the news and you have a celebrity that's gone through and is very open and honest about these things, but and also, you know, I'm happy to be open and honest about my own personal experience. And I think if you're a leader in the trust and you're quite open about that, it gives a level of approachability for people to come to you as well and say, you know, I've felt like that before. So I think there's a responsibility on all of us, and that role modelling can be really powerful.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I'll give the last word of this one to you.
Yeah, I just agree around that sense of having role models, whether that's kind of in work, colleagues, but also then kind of nationally, like prominent figures, sports people, famous people, celebrities. It just normalises these conversations to get to a point in the same way someone might talk about knee problems or something like this. And there's some interesting parallels. Remember, like Jake Goody, when her experience of cervical cancer, the rates of cervical cancer screening just increased massively. And that's kind of on the back of the prominence of that, and whether people then thought about their own health as a bit of a legacy to what she'd been through, really. To begin to see that mental health. And you can look, I did some like quick Google searches, think about people recently, Dele Alli, the football player, Stormzy, Bruce Springsteen, Dwayne Johnson, Michael Phelps, so many people speaking about it. I think that is beginning to maybe, enable people to realise they can talk a bit more.
Thank you, that's really, really helpful and good. I guess just by the conversation we're having, perhaps is still is as important. And I guess one of the things, just picking up on the point, is we all know a knee ache. We can probably feel a lump. But actually, what is it that, you know, if I'm feeling that my mental well-being isn't quite there, what are some of the indicators? You know, James, you talked earlier on about email starting to become a little bit, you know, seeing signs within, you know, someone's perhaps getting a little bit more aggressive in their emails, or things getting a little bit more heated more often. So I'm interested from a psychological point of view, actually, what are some of the things that individuals should be aware of that might indicate that they may or should seek some support? Because I think it's much easier when you have a cold or a cough to notice that than perhaps to notice that your mental well-being isn't as it should be.
Yeah, so things, I guess I was wondering, there's some things we might notice ourselves, and it might be the people close to us don't notice it as well. And they could be some things around changes in what we're doing, how we're interacting with people, our general shifts in the mood. I suppose in one way I just encourage people they're aware, and we're aware generally when something doesn't feel right for ourselves, and I'd encourage people at that point to maybe think about actually what help is available, where I might be able to access some information. You know, men are much more inclined to want to have some information maybe available digitally or online or something where they can access it with some anonymity and find out for themselves. And I think then it's the role of kind of the support organisations, the professionals are out there to help you really think and understand this a bit more. So I don't think you have to come forth with all the answers and be able to explain it all. It's people like me and sort of people who work in this role, it's our job to help you do that. But also you might notice it's often our loved ones, the people who are close to us, maybe our colleagues, like you're kind of pointing, picking up in their tone of communication in the email, that might notice it. I think if you're kind of your colleagues and people who know you are maybe commenting on things, that could be it.
So it's that openness perhaps to receive some feedback as well, that maybe you'd be okay. And then for individuals, I guess the point I'm inferring from what you're saying is that actually, if it doesn't feel right, if something just doesn't feel right, don't wait till, you know, it's extreme, just start to perhaps have the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
And from a personal example, I think, you know, I liken it almost to a container that's full of water, and then the one more drip causes it to kind of overflow. And certainly personally, I've been in a place where, you know, real pressures and stress within a role, restructured organisation previously, and I think it was only at the point that close friend of mine moved away, that was the trigger that made me, prompted that there's something wrong here, this isn't healthy. Fortunately, I was able to get out of the situation, so actually that resolved it. But actually, my reaction was unusual to what would have been something that was fairly routine, and I think that prompted me to think about the pressures and other compounding things that I was experiencing at that time.
That's really helpful. So just noticing how you're reacting to things and how that's changing in response to pressures being experienced. Thank you. Another question that I think we've had is around how to talk to the men in our respective lives, whether a friend, a partner, a son, a colleague, about their health and well-being. So, but whether physical or mental, is there any particular tips that you can give us, Rob? And then, if we can add to the panel.
Yeah. So I think having all of what's been discussed so far in mind when we're approaching those conversations, not coming with an assumption that someone doesn't want to talk as well. You're struggling with your mood or you're struggling with worry. There's a bit of a likelihood already you might be thinking actually people aren't interested, and if it's people close to you, comments about like worrying about being a burden and putting more on someone else. So there's already a lot that's going to maybe shut you down from talking about things already. So it takes a little bit, it takes a bit of persistence, it takes a bit of kind of compassion and sticking with it and a bit of patience. Then do that. Like someone might be hearing, they might still be listening, even if they're not saying much back themselves. And then also thinking about just styles of communication. So I think particularly when it's organisations or maybe things like mental health first aid and that, to know maybe there's a bit of a propensity for men when they're struggling, they might come with more of a problem to solve rather than the first thing, rather than a kind of ticket into the room is to talk about emotions. So maybe it's actually struggling around, maybe it's an issue with my boss, maybe it's an issue in my relationship, maybe it's a problem with something in the house that needs fixing. We've seen that. So Samaritans, interestingly, they did training and they changed the way that people that were answering their calls, because they thought a lot of men were ringing up and they were kind of initially talking about stuff that seemed quite maybe irrelevant. And actually it was just about having a bit of patience, and there was this almost testing out the person on the other end of the line. Are they listening? Do they care? Do I trust them? Before talking about maybe what was the more weighty thing that brought them to that call. So I think it's just trying to hold these things in mind.
That's really, really helpful, thank you, because I think it relates back, to the point you raised earlier on, James, which is the importance of building relationship, because it is that trust, I think, that enables colleagues to be able, we think in the work context, but actually in the home context as well. If the trust doesn't exist, perhaps people are less likely to speak up. I think one of the other things that we've had a question around, and I'll start with you again, Rob, is around the relationship between mental and physical health. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and why it's so important to acknowledge that relationship between mental and physical health in this context?
Sure. So I think they're just intrinsically linked. I would encourage any consideration of one to be looking at the other. I think sometimes we've got these ideas where they're a bit separate, really. And they can be quite reinforcing, both potentially in an unhelpful way, but also it can be a bit of a guide actually where we might be able to intervene and do something when we're struggling. So we know kind of mental health problems can have kind of physical manifestations, worry, stress, impacting things like heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugars, gastric problems, headaches. But also if you're really struggling with your mood and your energy, and you might be finding it harder to do things that you were previously doing that were helpful for you, whether that was socialising, exercise. You might be less inclined to be able to kind of get the shopping and the cooking you want to do. There's a greater propensity for men struggling to maybe lean in towards problematic alcohol use and use of substances as well. That's definitely sits a bit more. And increased levels of smoking. So there's all that side of things. We also know struggling with our physical health and pain can be detrimental to our mental health. So really it's just approaching these things and seeing them as one and maybe trying to bring them to conversations. But equally, we know actually being able to do some things that can be good about maintaining our physical health, whether that's around exercise, around managing to maintain some sleep, improve sleep, can also be very positive for our mental health, much more protective. Certain low-level regular exercise is equally, if not more effective than commonly prescribed antidepressants for lots of people. So yeah, I just think they're just intrinsically linked, really.
Okay, thank you. And I think, James, you had an example, you were sharing with us your love for cricket. Is it cricket?
It is cricket, yes. Just taking up cricket much later in life than most people do, and benefiting from the camaraderie, the physical it is quite a physical game. You're not just standing around in a field all afternoon. You know, you feel it afterwards. But actually, that you being part of a team, and then obviously the team looks out for each other. I think that again comes back to the point around being aware, supporting each other, and then as you grow with your teammates, you start to find out more about people, and they're more open to sharing things that maybe they're struggling with, and you get through it together ultimately and have a good time doing it. So.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for sharing that example. And I think we haven't touched on it, but one of the things you've made me think about is I think there's some increasing statistics around loneliness and isolation, and I don't know whether or not that relates in any way to this discussion. But Rob, is there anything you wanted to say about that in relation to kind of men's mental health and the connection?
Yeah, well, I thought that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we often think about sport, and the first thing we think about is the physical health improvements, but actually the social aspect, the camaraderie, building kind of relationships and strengths. And like in those settings, probably men are talking about their mental health actually, maybe in a slightly different way. And there's a bit of a preference for that. And we think about how some, like, say, primary care services are designed now, got kind of social prescribers, things like this. I think earlier we were having a bit of a chat, people mentioned like men's sheds, these sort of initiatives, they've been really effective. So it's definitely, I suppose that links to some of the things we've discussed, like if you want to have a conversation about mental health, maybe it's not just thinking about time to go to see their GP and get medication, obviously talking therapist, but actually what else might be useful.
Yeah.
And just on a personal level, I'd absolutely identify, I think sport and has had such a role in just kind of sustaining and keeping well, for me for sure.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I also wanted to just go back with Lee. I think you earlier on you mentioned how important it is to role model and to share, and I guess to help break down that kind of stigma sometimes that's associated with experiencing challenges in relation to one's mental health. So are you happy? You said you'd be happy to share.
Yeah,
so can you give us an
absolutely.
example, I guess, of where you've been affected and how you've addressed that?
Yeah, I can describe it. When you're talking about the science, it was a huge darkness and a massive blackness, darkness in my life. And I've since read the Black Dog book, which is a really helpful description of what depression is like and how it can come on and what you feel like, and the stigma that was attached. I did not want to admit that I was not well, and you just put a mask back on every day. You go back out and you go back out, and then one day the mask just will not go on, and there's the horrible darkness that surrounds you. Nobody can help. It's a really, really dark place to be, and a horrible place to be. And the tipping point for me was the thought of not being here anymore, and everything went quiet. I thought at that point, I thought, you have a problem. You need to go and find some help and get some proper help, which I did. I got to the point with antidepressants and stuff that I was starting to fight against them. I was like, no, I don't want this. But we managed to get through everything. Still taking regular exercise, being really careful with what I put into my body, whether that's alcohol, whether that's what food I put in, etc. And really just looked after myself. And it does, you do come out the other end, eventually. I remember the day that it started to really click back in. I could almost feel the synapses in my brain reconnecting, and this just the darkness, the clouds just starting to lift. And I think it's really important to talk about that in a normal sense, and to be in part of a conversation. Because if you break your arm, you go to A&E, you get it put in a plaster. 6 weeks later, they take it off. There's a bit of still work to go on, and it may twinge you for years to come, just like this may twinge me for years to come. There are still some days where I'm like, I really just not feeling this today, and there's a bit of it comes back. But I've learned coping mechanisms. I've learned how to talk myself down from things. I've learned how to be less anxious about certain things. And that's where the talking therapy is really powerful. And the antidepressants helped me get through the worst of it, I think. They kind of numbed everything for a while, for a few months, and then was able to move on. So yeah, I think it's important to put yourself out there and say, yeah, I've been through this. It's my experience, and if anybody wants to come and talk to me about it, then I'm more than happy to.
Thank you so much for sharing the story. And I guess, is there you talked about tipping point, and I think you talked about a tipping point as well. So my inference from the stories that you've told is that probably there are indicators, and the triggers are very different. The tipping points may be very, very different. And is there anything that you would advise colleagues or anyone, you know, watching this podcast about the point before the tipping point? Is there anything that you think actually you want people to really think about, or a message that you want to give around dealing with this? You know, as you said, you've come through the other end, and you know you have your niggles, but is there any advice that you would give colleagues watching?
I think it's difficult because I think so often you don't realise you're at that tipping point until, for me, it was like, oh no, that was then prompting me that this is becoming unhealthy. You know, the stress I'm feeling around a restructure. So actually, I've got to do something about that. And through talking to people, you know, people who care for me, my family, you know, other mentors, I was able to get out of that situation. And that's relatively straightforward. But I think probably it's almost like the benefit of hindsight is a beautiful thing, isn't it? But we don't have that all the time, do we? So
yeah, I mean, my husband was asking me, "Are you okay?" And he was constantly asking, "Are you okay? I'm worried that things aren't right. You don't seem yourself," and I just was not listening. And it just made me put the mask even more on, and like be even more bravado about, "Well, no, I'm absolutely fine. We're going to do this. We're going to do that." But it's inside. I just wanted to hide under the duvet and not come out for the longest time. And I don't know how you. But I know now that is where things are going, and I know that, you know, quite often all it takes for me is just to say, actually, I'm not going to do anything this weekend. I just want to go for a walk with the dog, eat some nice food, and just be relaxed and chilled. And that quite often is a great way for me to reset almost. So yeah, I don't know how you identify that, because I didn't want to admit.
I think from just hearing both of you talk about your own sort of individual experiences, that one of the key things is disengagement.
Yeah.
You start to become very isolated, you start to become very lone wolf. It's kind of that sort of like wolf pack mentality that as soon as, like a wolf for example, if it's then not well and it knows it's going to die, it will isolate itself from the pack to then not be a burden.
Yeah.
I think that's for me, even just in my own personal journey, that noticing that disengagement from the things that you enjoy, the people that you love, and pulling away that isolation of yourself, burying your head in the sand, that is the key sign for me personally that says I am not okay, I need to step forward rather than step back. And I think that that's what we as men are prone to doing, is that we will step back more so than step forward when it gets difficult or when it gets troublesome. We won't go through the thick of it as much. We will tend to step back to see if we can solutionize or rationalize another way around it. We're just like, you know, or maybe there's a different way of doing this, maybe there isn't something wrong with me, maybe it's my situation, and you start trying to come out of it. You become more sort of like process orientated around what it is that you can change around your environment, but sometimes it's what you've got to change within yourself. And it's fighting that disengagement and that isolation, because that's what ultimately brings you back out of it, is to then re-engage with the things that you love, to re-engage with the people that, you know, you want to engage with, and to not be pulling yourself away. It's that disengagement for me.
Yeah, my therapist spoke to me about going back and doing something that I used to love as a teenager, as a child, and that was theatre.
Yeah.
So I joined a theatre group, and now we're about to do show number 4, and I have frequently said to them, "You saved my life. This has saved my life. I was in such a horrible, dark place, and this has really just absolutely fixed me." Not 100%, there's a lot still to do, but yeah, I think, you know, that it's really important, as you say, to get something that you're that you can really engage with, something that is totally distracting from work, that's totally distracting from your personal life, and you get to be something else for whatever period that is.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Final word to you, Rob. Is there anything that we'd add to the conversation?
No, just really interesting to hear, and thank you for like the very personal stories, really. But it just reminded me, I've heard people say this to me, like, you know, the opposite of depression isn't necessarily happiness, it's connection, kind of reconnecting with yourself, reconnecting with other people. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, kind of medication and therapy helped you do something, but actually what it helped you do is make this change in your life, which is around connecting with people, finding something that felt purposeful and meaningful.
So I think that's a great way to end in terms of, I guess we come back full circle, that importance of connection, that importance of trust in kind of helping, I guess, build the conversations. So gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and for taking the time today. Hope that's been helpful to everyone watching. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.